It's no wonder one side of the story is being shown. Authorities set the tone, and they see protesters as enemy forces. And it began long before Baltimore turned ugly. The police and FBI used counter-terror apparatus on Black Lives Matter in New York. There are two instances where NYPD casually asserted these units were used on protesters in the press. Emails revealed California Highway Patrol used counter-terror units to monitor rallies in the Bay Area. In Massachusetts, counter-terror fusion centers were also used on protesters, according to the Boston Herald. Social media activity was tracked and fake accounts created. An FBI Joint Terror Task Force was used to track Black Lives Matter in Minnesota. Again, this was revealed in emails between local police officials and federal authorities. And finally, Missouri's National Guard viewed Ferguson protesters as enemy forces. Joining us in the Now is Adam Johnson. He's contributor for Alternet and the writer who put together these examples of terror tactics on protesters. In fact, there's many more. Adam, tell us, what does all of this imply?
Well, it implies that the similar tactics we saw during the Occupy movement, which is that the FBI has a kind of turnkey attitude with how these anti-terror apparatuses are set up, which is that things like monitoring, things like using fusion centers, which is where local and federal and state authorities kind of collect all their information, and the use of confidential human sources or informants, which is to say undercover agents or informants acting like protesters, gathering information, building relationships, that these things are being used on Black Lives Matter routinely. Now, there had been pockets of these stories that had come up from really good journalists, Darwin Von Graham of the East Bay Express, Lee Fang of The Intercept, had kind of done these isolated reports throughout these different cities. And what I did is simply put them together in one piece to show that this is part of a larger pattern, and I think it's fair to say part of a larger policy.
So this goes back as far as Occupy Wall Street. It wasn't Ferguson which sparked this shift of using counter-terror units. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, you could argue it actually, happened in 2004 during the DNC with the NYPD and their Joint Terror Task Force. It's always been the case since 9/11 that domestic dissent, environmentalist groups have been infiltrated, and the same anti-terror apparatuses are used on domestic activism. In 2010, the New Yorker did a study about the uses of the Patriot Act, and of the total amount of uses, the number was roughly 1,600 had been used on drug cases, and only 10 had been used in anti-terror cases. So anti-terror laws are almost never used to stop terrorism. They're used for domestic and criminal reasons.
Tell us a little bit more about how social media is being used, because of course that has developed tremendously since 2004.
Well, they're definitely monitoring social media, and I think it's important to make a distinction between what it means to monitor social media and to infiltrate social media. Oftentimes, you'll hear the press kind of recite the police say they created fake Twitter accounts to monitor social media, but what's important to understand is that Twitter is 100% public, more or less. So you don't really need to create fake accounts to monitor Twitter. You create fake social media accounts for the same reason that the FBI and the NYPD create fake protesters. They do it to infiltrate. They do it to gain confidence, to gather intelligence, and they're doing that online. They're almost certainly doing that on Facebook. We know the FBI creates fake terrorists all the time on Facebook to lure people into their entrapments. They've done that in, I guess, about 6 cases that we know of. So these things are pretty pervasive. The distinction between them doing it to catch, these sort of ISIS plots and domestic terrorists are basically non-distinguishable. They're sort of similar patterns that they use.
You mentioned in this article that despite CNN revealing the use of language by Ferguson police about protesters, the media's own phrases like quelling riots is dangerous. Why?
Right. Well, words matter. These martial terms that are used domestically, while they may seem superficial, actually have a very pernicious effect about how people perceive these things. Particularly, how governors justify bringing in the National Guard. So I think, yesterday was really weird because even the moderate media was using the term Baltimore uprising, which is a term usually, I would say the radical left generally uses. It's a term I prefer. But what happened was Baltimore Uprising was trending on Twitter. So you saw Mashable and Slate start to hashtag Baltimore Uprising, which of course has a very different connotation than Baltimore riots. Riots give the impression of sort of mindless violence, just like the word thug, which in the intro they push back on. But the term uprising has a more sort of romantic, a more political connotation. So, you know, how we describe these things matters a lot.
All right, Adam Johnson, contributor for Alternet, breaking that down for us in the now. Thanks so much.